Margaret Thornton ripped off her wedding ring and hurled it across the courtroom floor. It bounced twice, spinning to a stop at her husband's Italian leather shoes. Richard Thornton laughed. His lawyers laughed. The reporters in the gallery smirked at the desperate housewife making a scene. "Pick it up," Richard said, pointing at the ring. "That's the most expensive thing you'll ever touch again." Margaret didn't move. She didn't cry. She simply looked at the clock on the wall. 10:00 a.m. Exactly on time. "No," she whispered. "The most expensive thing in this room is about to walk through that door." Before we continue, if you want to see justice served, subscribe to this channel and follow Margaret's story to the very end. Drop a comment telling me which city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let me take you back to the beginning. To the moment Margaret Thornton's world shattered, and the moment she decided to shatter her husband's world right back. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Margaret Thornton was in her garden kneeling in the dirt, her hands buried in soil as she transplanted tomato seedlings. She had been married to Richard Thornton for 15 years. She had spent those years building a home raising no children because Richard didn't want any supporting his dreams while quietly burying her own. She was 42 years old. Her knees ached from kneeling. Her back hurt from years of carrying weight that wasn't hers. The mailman called out from the gate. "Mrs. Thornton, got something needs your signature." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the fence. The mailman's face was strange, sympathetic, pitying. "Thank you, Harold." "You take care now, Mrs. Thornton." She didn't understand his tone until she opened the envelope. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The words blurred. She read them again and again. Petitioner Richard Allen Thornton. Respondent Margaret Jane Thornton. Grounds irreconcilable differences. Attached were 47 pages of demands. Richard wanted the penthouse. Richard wanted the cars. Richard wanted full ownership of Thornton Industries, the tech company she had helped him build from nothing. Richard wanted her to walk away with $5,000 and a confidentiality agreement. $5,000. For 15 years of her life. Margaret sat down on the porch steps. Her hands trembled. The tomato seedlings sat in their tray waiting to be planted. She wouldn't plant them today. Her phone rang 20 minutes later. The screen showed Richard's name. "You got the papers?" His voice was flat, businesslike, the same voice he used in board meetings. "I got them." "Good. Sign them by Friday. My lawyer says we can expedite this if you cooperate." Margaret stared at the garden she had built, the roses she had nursed through winter, the vegetable beds she had designed herself. "Richard, can we talk about this?" "There's nothing to talk about. I've made my decision." 15 years, Richard. 15 years and you send me papers through the mail. A sigh. Heavy, annoyed. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Margaret. You knew this was coming." "I didn't know anything." "Then you weren't paying attention." His voice sharpened. "Look, I'm being generous. $5,000 is more than you deserve. You brought nothing to this marriage. I brought everything to this marriage. You brought your sad little savings account and your community college education. I built Thornton Industries. I made something of myself. You just existed. You cooked. You cleaned. You smiled at dinner parties and pretended to understand business." Margaret closed her eyes. "I formatted every business plan you ever wrote. I stayed up until 3 in the morning helping you prepare for investor meetings. I held you when you cried after your first startup failed. Anyone could have done that." The words hit like a slap. "Sign the papers, Margaret. Don't make me embarrass you in court." The line went dead. Margaret sat in silence for a long time. The sun moved across the sky. Shadows lengthened. Her phone buzzed with text messages she didn't read. When the sky turned orange, she finally stood up. She walked inside, washed her hands, and made herself a cup of tea. Then she picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in 17 years. It rang once, twice. Hello? A woman's voice, sharp, professional. Eleanor, it's Margaret. Silence. Maggie. Yes. A long pause. When Eleanor spoke again, her voice was different. Softer. Younger. You're calling me. After 17 years, you're actually calling me. I need help. What kind of help? Margaret looked at the divorce papers spread across her kitchen table. Richard filed for divorce. He's trying to take everything. Everything meaning? The company, the properties. He wants to leave me with $5,000. Eleanor laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. $5,000. Does he know who you are? No, he never did. And whose fault is that? Margaret didn't answer. You walked away, Maggie. You walked away from the family. From me. From Dad. You said you wanted a normal life. You said you wanted someone who loved you for you. I know what I said. And now, what happened to your normal life? What happened to true love? Margaret's voice cracked. He was seeing someone else, a woman from his office, 26 years old. He told me I was dead weight. Silence. He said that to you. He said that to me. Eleanor's voice hardened into steel. Give me his lawyer's name. Eleanor. Give me his lawyer's name, his company's financial records, and anything else you have. Send it to my encrypted email, the one from before. You still have that address? I kept it, in case you ever... Eleanor stopped herself. Just send the files. I'll call Dad. No, don't call him. Maggie, if Richard is trying to take your assets, we need... I don't want Dad involved, not yet. Let me handle this myself. A bitter laugh. Handle it yourself with what your community college education. Eleanor? No. Maggie, listen to me. You left because you wanted to prove you didn't need the family name. Fine. But you're not going to prove anything by letting some tech bro take you to the cleaners. This isn't about pride anymore. This is about survival. I know. Do you? Because the Maggie I knew would have called us the moment she saw trouble coming. But you waited. You waited until he ambushed you. Until you had no options. I didn't think he would do this. You didn't want to think he would do this. There's a difference. Margaret pressed her hand against her eyes. Are you going to help me or lecture me? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. I can do both. Her voice softened just slightly. Send me the files. I'll look at them tonight. And Maggie? Yes. Don't sign anything. Don't say anything to him. Don't answer his calls. From now on, you're a ghost. Understand? I understand. Good. Welcome back, sister. The line went dead. Margaret set down her phone. Her hands were steady now. For the first time in 15 years, she felt something besides tired. She felt awake. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Margaret spent those weeks in a strange suspension. Richard had moved out of the penthouse 2 months earlier, claiming he needed space for work. Now she understood what kind of work. She followed Eleanor's instructions. She didn't call Richard. She didn't respond to his texts. She didn't sign the papers. Her court-appointed lawyer was a nervous young man named Daniel Park. He had graduated from law school 2 years ago and looked like he hadn't slept since. Mrs. Thornton, Daniel said during their first meeting, his hands shuffling through papers. I have to be honest with you. Please. Richard has hired Marcus Webb. Margaret didn't recognize the name. He's sometimes called the executioner of Wall Street. He doesn't just win cases. He destroys people, reputations, careers, lives. He's never lost a divorce case in 18 years. Never. Not once. And I'm... Daniel swallowed hard. I'm a public defender. I handle traffic violations and small claims. I've never faced anyone like Marcus Webb. Then why did they assign you to my case? Daniel's face reddened. Because they don't think it's worth assigning anyone better. Richard has resources, connections. The court assumes you'll settle. They assume I'll give up. Yes. Margaret looked at the young lawyer. He was sweating through his cheap suit. His hands trembled slightly as he organized his files. Daniel, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you believe I deserve more than $5,000? He blinked. That's not really. Do you believe it? Daniel set down his papers. He looked at her directly for the first time. Yes, I do. You were married for 15 years. You supported him. You managed the household. You gave up your career. You deserve half of everything. Then fight for it. Mrs. Thornton, I don't think you understand what we're up against. I understand perfectly. Margaret leaned forward. I understand that my husband thinks I'm weak. He thinks I'm alone. He thinks I have no resources and no options. He's about to find out he's wrong about all of it. What do you mean? Margaret smiled. It was not a kind smile. I mean I have resources he doesn't know about. But I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Daniel hesitated. I can try. Good. Now here's what I need you to do. When we walk into that courtroom, I need you to look nervous. I am nervous. Even more nervous. I need Richard to think he's already won. I need him comfortable, arrogant. I need him laughing. Why? Because people make mistakes when they're laughing. The morning of the preliminary hearing, Margaret dressed carefully. She chose her oldest dress. Gray faded, purchased at a thrift store 5 years ago when she was trying to save money for Richard's second startup. She pulled her hair back into a severe bun. She wore no jewelry except her wedding ring. She looked at herself in the mirror. She looked beaten. Poor. Alone. Perfect. The Superior Court of Manhattan was everything Daniel had described. The building smelled of old wood and desperation. Dozens of couples filed through security, their faces tight with anger and grief. Margaret walked through the halls with her head down. A woman defeated. A woman who knew she had already lost. Richard was already inside the courtroom. He sat at the plaintiff's table surrounded by lawyers in expensive suits. 3 assistants, 2 paralegals. Marcus Webb himself, a silver-haired man with the cold eyes of a predator. Richard wore a tailored Italian suit, a watch that cost more than most people's cars. He looked sleek, powerful, untouchable. When Margaret entered, he looked up, his lips curved into a smile. There she is, he murmured to Marcus Webb. The woman who thinks she deserves half my company. Webb chuckled. She won't get a dime. She'll get exactly what she's worth. Nothing. Margaret walked to the defendant's table. Daniel was already there. His papers scattered, his hands shaking. He looked like he might vomit. How are you feeling? Margaret asked quietly. Terrible. You... ready? For what? Margaret looked at the clock. 9:47 a.m. You'll see. Judge Caroline Hayes entered at exactly 10:00 a.m. She was a small woman with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had presided over hundreds of divorces, seen every trick, heard every lie. We are here for the preliminary hearing in the matter of Thornton versus Thornton, Judge Hayes announced. Mr. Webb, you may begin. Marcus Webb rose like a shark surfacing from deep water. Your Honor, this case is simple. My client Richard Thornton built Thornton Industries from the ground up. He worked 18-hour days. He sacrificed his health, his youth, his peace of mind. And what did the respondent contribute? Webb pointed at Margaret. Nothing. Mrs. Thornton is a homemaker with no education, no business experience, and no assets of her own. She contributed nothing to the marriage except her presence. And frankly, Your Honor, presence is not worth $500 million. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Reporters scribbled notes. Someone in the back laughed. Richard leaned back in his chair, smiling. We are asking for a full dissolution with minimal asset division, Webb continued. $5,000 in compensation, which is more than generous given the circumstances. We are also seeking a comprehensive NDA to prevent Mrs. Thornton from making false claims about my client in the future." "What kind of false claims?" Judge Hayes asked. "The usual kind, Your Honor. Slander, defamation. Mrs. Thornton may attempt to damage my client's reputation out of spite." "I see. Mr. Park." "Your response?" Daniel stood up. His voice cracked on the first word. "Your Honor, Mrs. Thornton was a loyal wife for 15 years. She managed the household. She supported Mr. Thornton emotionally and practically during the founding years of his company. She deserves fair compensation." "Fair compensation?" Webb laughed. "Define fair, Mr. Park. She didn't write code. She didn't close deals. She didn't do anything except cook dinner and look pleasant at parties. That's not. Do you have any evidence that Mrs. Thornton contributed meaningfully to Thornton Industries' financial records? Business correspondence? Anything?" Daniel faltered. "We're still gathering. You have nothing." Webb turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this is a waste of the court's time. Mrs. Thornton is a gold digger trying to profit from a marriage she contributed nothing to. We request immediate dismissal." Margaret sat perfectly still. She looked at the clock, 9:58 a.m. She looked at Richard. He was grinning, leaning over to whisper something to one of his assistants. She looked at the courtroom doors. Closed. 9:59 a.m. Daniel leaned toward her, panicking. "Mrs. Thornton, I don't know what to do. They're going to destroy us." Margaret didn't answer. 10:00 a.m. She stood up. "Mrs. Thornton," Judge Hayes said sharply, "you have not been recognized." "I apologize, Your Honor, but my actual legal team has arrived." Richard laughed out loud. "Legal team? What legal team?" "The cashier from the grocery store." The courtroom doors exploded open. They came in like an army. 6 men in black tactical suits moving with the precision of military operators. They spread out, forming a corridor, their eyes scanning the room. Behind them walked a man and a woman. The man was older, perhaps 72, with silver hair and cold blue eyes. He carried a cane with a silver handle shaped like a lion's head. He didn't need the cane to walk. He carried it because it looked like a weapon. The woman was younger, late 30s, with sharp features that mirrored Margaret's. She wore a white suit that cost more than Marcus Webb's entire wardrobe. She carried a leather briefcase stamped with a golden crest. Behind them came 12 lawyers, not the sweating, nervous lawyers of public defense. These were apex predators. They carried stacks of files thick enough to crush a man's life. The room went silent. Marcus Webb's smile froze on his face. Richard's laughter died in his throat. The silver-haired man walked down the center aisle. He stopped in the middle of the courtroom and looked at the judge. "My apologies for the interruption, Your Honor. Manhattan traffic is truly atrocious." His voice was deep, commanding, the voice of a man who had never been told no. "I am Charles Whitmore." The silence that followed was absolute. Everyone in that room knew that name. The Whitmores weren't just rich. They were the foundation upon which American wealth was built. Steel, shipping, media, real estate. They had been wealthy before the country had borders. "Charles Whitmore," Marcus Webb managed to say. "The industrialist." "The same." The woman in white stepped forward. "And I am Eleanor Whitmore Hayes, senior partner at Whitmore Legal Group." Webb's face went gray. Whitmore Legal Group didn't handle normal cases. They handled international treaties, royal divorces, matters of state. They didn't come to Superior Court for a tech CEO. "We are here," Charles Whitmore said, representing the defendant. He turned to look at Margaret. His cold eyes softened. "Hello, sweetheart." Margaret walked out from behind her table. She walked past the frozen Daniel Park, past the stunned reporters, past her husband's gaping face. She embraced the older man. "Hi, Dad." Richard's scream echoed off the walls. "Dad! That's impossible. She's Margaret Jones from Wyoming. She's nobody. Charles Whitmore released his daughter and turned slowly to face Richard. The affection vanished from his face. What replaced it was something colder than ice, something older than money. Hatred. She is Margaret Whitmore, Charles said, his voice dropping to a growl. She used her mother's maiden name because she wanted a simple life. She wanted to find a man who would love her for who she was, not what she had. Charles took a step toward Richard. His security team tensed but didn't move. She thought she found that man in you. Richard stumbled backward, nearly falling over his chair. We gave her 15 years, Charles continued. 15 years to play house. We stayed away as she asked. We let her live in your mediocre apartments. We let her drive your embarrassing cars. We watched from a distance while she tried to build something real with you. His cane struck the floor like a judge's gavel. But then you decided to hurt her. Eleanor slammed her briefcase onto the defendant's table. The sound was like a gunshot. You didn't just file for divorce, Richard, Eleanor said, opening the case. You tried to humiliate her. You tried to leave a Whitmore penniless. She pulled out a document. This is a motion to dismiss your fraudulent claims. She pulled out another document thicker. And this is a countersuit. Marcus Webb found his voice. Countersuit on what grounds? Fraud, embezzlement, corporate espionage, adultery. Eleanor ticked off her fingers. And conspiracy to defraud federal regulators. Richard's legs gave out. He collapsed into his chair. You're bluffing. Margaret is nobody. She cooked my dinner. She did my laundry. She did your laundry, Charles said, his voice dripping with disgust. Because she loved you, not because she had to. He leaned forward until his face was inches from Richard's. You treated a queen like a servant, and you were too stupid to know the difference. Margaret spoke then. Her voice was calm, but it carried to every corner of the room. Richard. He looked up at her. His arrogance was gone. In its place was something he had never shown her before. Fear. Who do you think funded your seed round for Thornton Industries? Richard blinked. Angel investors. A consortium called WM Holdings. WM Holdings. Margaret's lips curved. WM, as in Whitmore. The color drained from Richard's face. My trust fund, Margaret said simply. I authorized the investment 15 years ago. I own 49% of your company through shell corporations. My family owns another 12%. She smiled. That means we own 61%. I'm not just your wife, Richard. She leaned down until her face was level with his. I'm your boss. Richard opened his mouth. No sound came out. We're freezing all assets of Thornton Industries effective immediately, Eleanor announced. We're also serving you with eviction notice for the penthouse. The building is owned by Whitmore Properties. You have 24 hours to vacate. You can't do this, Richard whispered. I built that company. It's mine. You built it with my money, Margaret said, and my patience, both of which have run out. Charles Whitmore tapped his cane against the floor. Your Honor, I suggest a brief recess. My son-in-law appears to need a moment to call his mistress and tell her he can't afford the hotel room anymore. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Judge Hayes banged her gavel, calling for order, but no one was listening. Reporters were frantically typing. Marcus Webb was shouting at his associates. Daniel Park was staring at Margaret like he had never seen her before. Richard slumped in his chair, surrounded by the wreckage of his life. Margaret leaned close one final time. You wanted a war, Richard. Her voice was soft, almost gentle. The Whitmores don't lose wars. We end them. She turned and walked out, flanked by her father, her sister, and a wall of bodyguards. The courtroom doors closed behind her. Richard sat alone in the noise, the smell of his expensive cologne now sour with the scent of fear. He had come here to destroy his wife. He hadn't realized he was declaring war on an empire, and the Empire had just fired its first shot. The hour-long recess lasted exactly 12 minutes for Richard Thornton. He burst out of the courthouse doors, his Italian leather shoes slapping against the marble steps. His hands shook so badly he dropped his car keys twice before managing to unlock his Porsche. "It's a bluff," he muttered, jamming the key into the ignition. "It has to be a bluff. Nobody hides being a billionaire for 15 years. Nobody." The engine roared to life. Richard peeled out of the parking structure, running a red light, then another. Horns blared. A taxi driver screamed obscenities. Richard didn't hear any of it. He fumbled for his phone, nearly sideswiping a delivery truck. "Gregory, pick up, pick up." Gregory Foster was his chief financial officer, the man who knew where every dollar went, the man who had helped Richard bury the bodies for 3 years. Richard. Gregory's voice was strange, thin, frightened. "Where are you?" "I'm at the office, but Richard, you shouldn't come here." "I'm the CEO. I go where I want." "Listen to me." "No, you listen. I need you to move the offshore accounts, the Caymans, the Zurich holdings. Transfer everything to the crypto wallets we set up. Do it now." Silence. "Gregory, I can't do that, Richard." "What do you mean you can't? I'm giving you a direct order." Gregory's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're already here." "Who's already there?" "The Whitmores. Their auditors arrived 20 minutes ago. They have federal marshals with them. They're in the server room right now." Richard's blood turned to ice. "That's impossible. They can't just walk into my building." "It's not your building anymore, Richard. They showed me the ownership documents. Whitmore Holdings has controlled the lease since 2019. We've been paying rent to Margaret's family for 5 years. The phone slipped from Richard's hand. He was driving 90 miles per hour on the highway, but he felt like he was standing still, like the world was collapsing around him in slow motion. He swerved across 3 lanes, took the exit toward Thornton Industries headquarters. If he could just get to the server room, if he could delete the files. The evidence of the embezzlement he'd been committing for 3 years to fund his lifestyle, his gambling debts, Amber's expensive tastes. He could still survive this. He had to survive this. The underground parking garage was dark and cold. Richard abandoned his Porsche in a handicapped spot and sprinted toward the private elevator. He pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner. Beep, beep, beep. Access denied. Richard stared at the red light. He wiped his thumb on his jacket, tried again. Access denied. User ID invalid. No, 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 no. He kicked the steel doors hard enough to dent them. "Mr. Thornton." Richard spun around. 2 security guards stood behind him. Men he had hired. Men whose paychecks he signed every 2 weeks. But they weren't smiling. They weren't deferential. They looked at him like he was a stranger. "Open this elevator," Richard commanded. "We can't do that, sir." "I'm the CEO of this company." "Not anymore." The taller guard's voice was flat, professional. "We've been instructed to escort you to the boardroom. Visitor access only." "Visitor?" Richard's face contorted with rage. "I own this building." "This way, sir." They flanked him, not touching, but close enough to grab him if he ran. Richard had no choice but to follow. They led him to the service elevator, the freight elevator, the one used by maintenance workers and delivery drivers. Richard Thornton, CEO of Thornton Industries, rode up 40 floors in a metal box that smelled of cleaning supplies and cardboard. When the doors opened, the office was silent. Every desk was occupied. Analysts, developers, marketing teams, all of them working, none of them looking up. But Richard could feel their eyes. He could feel their knowledge. They knew. The gossip had traveled faster than he could drive. The boardroom doors were frosted glass. Richard could see shadows moving inside. Lots of shadows. He pushed through without knocking. The scene stopped him cold. The long mahogany table was full. Every board member was present. Men and women Richard had bullied, flattered, and manipulated for years. People who used to look at him with respect, with fear. Today, they wouldn't meet his eyes. And at the head of the table in his chair sat Margaret. She had changed. The gray dress was gone. She wore a tailored navy blazer, now sharp and commanding. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders. She sat in the leather chair like she had been born there, like she belonged. To her right sat Charles Whitmore, flipping through spreadsheets with the boredom of a man reviewing a child's homework. To her left was Eleanor typing rapidly on a tablet. In the corner stood Gregory Foster, sweating through his shirt, looking like he wanted to disappear into the wall. "You're in my chair," Richard snarled. Margaret looked up. Her eyes were calm, clear, utterly without fear. "I'm in the chairman's chair," she said. "And since I represent the majority shareholder interest as of 45 minutes ago, this is my seat. You can't just take over. I have a contract. I have executive protections." Eleanor spoke without looking up from her tablet. "Article 15, Section C of your employment agreement. The CEO may be removed immediately and without severance in the event of gross misconduct or criminal negligence." "I haven't done anything criminal." Richard's eyes darted to Gregory, a silent plea, a desperate warning. Margaret picked up a manila folder and slid it across the table. It stopped perfectly at the edge, right in front of Richard. "Gregory told us everything." Richard's head snapped toward his CFO. "You traitor." Gregory couldn't meet his eyes. "I have a family, Richard. Mr. Whitmore's auditors found the discrepancies in 10 minutes. They offered me immunity if I cooperated. I'm sorry." "Sorry." Richard lunged toward Gregory. 2 security guards materialized, grabbing Richard's arms before he could take 3 steps. "The renovation costs for the penthouse that were billed as server upgrades," Margaret said, opening the folder. "The company jet trips to Mykonos listed as client development. The jewelry receipts for Amber Sullivan labeled as office supplies." She looked up at him. "You stole $5 million from your own company, Richard. From our company. It's not stealing if I own the company. But you don't own the company." Charles Whitmore finally spoke. He took off his reading glasses and folded them with deliberate slowness. "You took out a loan against your equity 3 years ago to pay off your gambling debts in Las Vegas. You remember that. You used your shares as collateral." Richard felt the floor tilt beneath him. "The loan was held by a private equity firm called Centurion Capital," Charles continued. "Guess who owns Centurion Capital?" Richard didn't answer. He couldn't breathe. "I do. And since you missed your last 2 margin calls, I foreclosed on the collateral this morning. Your shares belong to me now." "This is a setup." Richard's voice cracked. "You planned this. You trapped me." "I didn't trap you." Margaret stood up from the chair. She walked around the table until she was standing inches from him. Close enough to touch. Close enough to hurt. "I gave you a safety net, Richard. For 15 years I covered for you. I used my dividends to plug the holes you kept digging because I wanted you to succeed. I wanted to believe you were just stressed, not corrupt, not cruel." Her voice trembled, not with sadness, with rage held barely in check. "But then you looked at me across the breakfast table and told me I was dead weight. You told me I was holding you back. You said I brought nothing to this marriage." She leaned closer. "You wanted to fly, Richard, fine. Fly. But I'm taking back the wings I bought you." She turned to face the board. "I call for a vote to remove Richard Thornton as CEO, effective immediately pending a criminal investigation into embezzlement." "Seconded," said a board member Richard had considered an ally. "All in favor." Every hand in the room went up. Even Gregory's trembling hand rose. Motion carried. Margaret looked at the security guards. "Please escort Mr. Thornton off the premises. He is not to remove any items from his office. His personal effects will be boxed and shipped to wherever he ends up living." Margaret, wait. Richard's arrogance finally shattered. His voice came out broken, pleading. "We can talk about this. I was stressed. I made mistakes. I love you. I've always loved you." Margaret looked at him. For one moment, Richard saw something flicker in her eyes. The ghost of the woman who had loved him for 15 years. Then it was gone. You don't love me, Richard. You loved the idea that you were better than me. She turned her back. Get him out of here. Richard screamed as they dragged him toward the door. He screamed her name. He screamed threats and promises and apologies that meant nothing. Margaret didn't look back. She sat down in the CEO's chair, took a deep breath, and looked at the board. Now, she said, let's get to work cleaning up this mess. The sidewalk outside Thornton Industries was cold. Richard stood there in his wrinkled suit, his hair disheveled, his dignity in pieces at his feet. The security guards had literally shoved him through the revolving doors. People were staring. Someone was filming him with their phone. He needed to get away. He needed a drink. He needed to think. He patted his pockets. Phone, wallet. That was something. He tried to hail a cab. 3 of them passed without stopping. Finally, a yellow taxi pulled over. Richard climbed in his expensive suit, scraping against the torn vinyl seats. The Ritz-Carlton. He dialed Amber's number. She was his lifeline now. She understood the world of high stakes. They could figure something out together, flee the country, start over. He had hidden some cash somewhere, surely. Richard. Amber answered on the first ring. Where are you? I've been waiting for 2 hours. The room service champagne is warm. Forget the champagne. Pack your bags. We're leaving tonight. Leaving? What are you talking about? Did you win? It's complicated. Just pack. I'll be there in 10 minutes. He hung up before she could ask more questions. He opened his banking app. He needed to transfer whatever cash remained before the freeze hit everything. He logged in. Balance $0. Richard blinked. Refreshed the page. Balance $247,000. Overdraft fee applied. What? He screamed so loud the taxi driver swerved. He checked transaction history. 1 massive transfer, court-ordered asset freeze. Superior Court docket 49221. No. The cab pulled up to the Ritz-Carlton. That'll be $23.50, the driver said. Richard handed over his black American Express, the card that had no limit, the card that opened every door. The driver swiped it. Declined. Try it again. It's declined, buddy. Richard tried his Visa. Declined. His MasterCard. Declined. He checked his wallet. A single crumpled $20 bill. He threw it at the driver and stumbled out of the cab. The Ritz-Carlton lobby was all marble and gold. 2 days ago, Richard had walked through here like he owned the place. Now the concierge looked at him with barely concealed suspicion. Richard took the elevator to the penthouse suite. He burst through the door. Amber, we need to talk. She was lounging on the sofa in silk pajamas, scrolling through her phone. When she looked up, her expression shifted from annoyance to alarm. My God, Richard, you look terrible. What happened? They froze the accounts. They took the company. Margaret, she's not who I thought she was. Amber sat up slowly. What do you mean? She's a Whitmore. Amber's phone slipped from her fingers. A Whitmore like the Whitmores. Her father is Charles Whitmore. They ambushed me in court. They took everything. Richard grabbed her shoulders. But we can fix this. You have savings, right? We can go to Mexico, to Dubai. Somewhere they can't touch us. I have contacts. I can rebuild. Amber stared at him. Slowly, deliberately, she removed his hands from her shoulders. She stood up and took a step back. You lost the company. They stole it. But I'll get it back. I just need you to help me for a few weeks. A few months at most. Amber laughed. It was not the laugh of a woman who loved him. It was cold, sharp. The laugh of someone calculating odds and finding them unfavorable. Help you, she repeated. Richard, do you know why I'm with you? Because we're good together. Because we understand each other. I'm with you because you bought me a Cartier bracelet last Tuesday. I'm with you because you promised to make me VP of marketing. I'm with you because you were a winner." She looked him up and down. Her lip curled. "But right now, you look like a loser. A broke loser." "Amber, please. Don't." She held up a hand. "You're telling me you're going up against the Whitmores. Do you understand what that means? They will crush you into dust, and I am not getting dust on my Louboutins." She walked to the closet and pulled out a designer handbag. "Where are you going?" "Out. I have dinner with Michael Chen tonight, the hedge fund manager. He's been texting me for weeks. I didn't respond because you were the bigger fish." She slung the bag over her shoulder. "Now you're just bait. You can't leave me. I left my wife for you." Amber paused at the door. She looked back at him with something that might have been pity if pity were made of ice. "And she turned out to be a billionaire." Amber shrugged. "Looks like you're the idiot, Richard. Don't call me." The door slammed behind her. Richard stood in the middle of the hotel suite. Alone. Truly alone. A knock at the door made him jump. Hope flickered in his chest. Amber came back. She changed her mind. He rushed to open it. It wasn't Amber. Eleanor Whitmore Hayes stood in the hallway flanked by two uniformed police officers. She held out a manila envelope. "What is this?" Richard whispered. "I tried to catch you at the office, but you left in such a hurry." Eleanor's voice was crisp, professional, enjoying this. "This is a subpoena and a warrant." "Warrant for what?" "Grand larceny, wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy to defraud federal regulators." Eleanor smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "My father doesn't appreciate it when people steal from his family. We completed a full forensic audit over lunch. It seems you embezzled approximately $5.3 million over the past 4 years." The police officer stepped forward. "Richard Thornton, you're under arrest. You have the right to remain silent." "No." Richard's voice came out as a whimper. "This can't be happening." "It's very much happening." The handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Cold. Final. "Oh, and Richard," Eleanor added as the officers turned him around. "The hotel manager asked me to inform you that your credit card was declined for the suite. They'll be holding your luggage until payment is rendered." "I have nothing," Richard screamed as they dragged him down the hallway. Guests peered out of their rooms, watching the spectacle. "I have nothing." Eleanor pulled out her phone as the elevator doors closed on Richard's anguished face. She dialed a number. "Dad, it's done. He's in custody." She listened for a moment. "Yes, I'll tell her. The pest control is finished." She hung up and walked toward the elevator, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Behind her, the penthouse suite sat empty. The champagne was still warm. The silk pajamas Amber had worn lay crumpled on the sofa. And somewhere in the building, Richard Thornton was learning that the fall from the top is much faster than the climb. 3 weeks passed. Richard sat in a holding cell at Rikers Island, wearing an orange jumpsuit that had been worn by 100 men before him. The fabric scratched against his skin. The toilet was 3 feet from his bed. The food was gray and tasteless. His arraignment had been a disaster. The judge had set bail at $2 million. Richard's remaining assets, what little the Whitmores hadn't frozen, amounted to less than $50,000. He had called everyone he knew. Former business partners refused to take his calls. Golf buddies claimed they were out of town. The investors he had wined and dined for years suddenly didn't recognize his number. Finally, a man named Victor Castellano agreed to post bail. Victor was a loan shark Richard had borrowed from 3 years ago to cover gambling debts. Victor charged 40% interest. Victor employed men who broke kneecaps for a living. But Victor was Richard's only option. The day Richard walked out of Rikers, Victor was waiting in a black sedan. "You look terrible," Victor said, rolling down the window. "I've been in jail for 3 weeks. And now you owe me $2 million. Plus interest, plus the original debt you never paid off." Richard climbed into the back seat. The leather was cold. "I'll pay you back. All of it. I just need time." "Time is money, Richard, and you're running out of both. The sedan pulled away from Rikers Island. Richard stared out the window at the Manhattan skyline. 3 weeks ago, he had owned a piece of that skyline. Now he couldn't afford a hot dog from a street vendor. "Where am I supposed to go?" he asked. "Not my problem." Victor lit a cigar. "But I'd suggest somewhere cheap. You've got lawyers to pay and debts coming due. The Whitmores have frozen everything connected to your name. Your credit is destroyed. Your reputation is worse." Richard closed his eyes. "I'm going to fight this." Victor laughed, smoke curling from his lips. "Fight the Whitmores. Good luck with that. You'd have better odds fighting God." The sedan dropped Richard at a Motel 6 in Queens. The room cost $47 a night, paid in cash from the money Victor had grudgingly advanced him. Richard sat on the stained bedspread and stared at the water-damaged ceiling. He had one card left to play. The Whitmores had money. They had power. They had lawyers who could crush him like an insect. But Richard had something they didn't. He had a story. The public loved an underdog. They loved to see billionaires exposed as villains. They loved the narrative of the little guy fighting back against impossible odds. Richard wasn't the villain of this story. He was the victim. And he was going to make the whole world believe it. He picked up his phone, a cheap prepaid model Victor had provided, and dialed a number. "Diane, it's Richard Thornton." "Yes, that Richard Thornton. I have a story for you, an exclusive. The Whitmores set me up. They destroyed an innocent man, and I can prove it." He listened for a moment, then smiled. It was the first time he had smiled in 3 weeks. "Tomorrow morning I'll be there, and Diane, make sure the cameras are ready. America is going to want to see this." He hung up and lay back on the bed. The Whitmores thought they had won. They were wrong. The war was just beginning. The interview aired at 7 in the morning on national television. Richard Thornton sat across from Diane Mitchell, America's most watched morning host. He wore a simple gray sweater, no designer labels, no flashy watch. His eyes were red-rimmed. His hands trembled slightly as he held a coffee cup. He looked broken. He looked perfect. "Richard," Diane said, leaning forward with practiced sympathy, "thank you for being brave enough to share your story. Thank you for giving me a chance to tell the truth." Richard's voice cracked. He had practiced that crack for 2 hours in the motel bathroom. "The Whitmores have tried to silence me, but the American people deserve to know what really happened. Tell us, in your own words." Richard took a deep breath. He looked directly into the camera. "I fell in love with a woman named Margaret Jones, a simple woman from Wyoming. At least that's who I thought she was." He paused for effect. "For 15 years I worked 18-hour days building Thornton Industries. I sacrificed everything, my health, my friendships, my peace of mind. And the whole time my wife was lying to me." "Lying how?" "She's not Margaret Jones. She's Margaret Whitmore. Her father is Charles Whitmore, one of the richest men in America. She married me as part of some sick test, some game the ultra-wealthy play with regular people's lives." Diane's eyes widened. The cameraman zoomed in. "She watched me struggle," Richard continued, his voice rising with manufactured emotion. "She watched me develop ulcers from stress. She watched me beg for investors while her family sat on billions. She could have helped me at any time. Instead, she took notes." "That's horrifying." "It gets worse." Richard leaned forward. "When I started to succeed, when Thornton Industries finally took off, suddenly her family swooped in. They fabricated evidence. They bribed my employees. They had me arrested on false charges. The embezzlement charges, lies, all of it. I moved money within my own company to protect it from what I suspected was a hostile takeover. I didn't know the hostile takeover was coming from my own wife." Richard's eyes glistened with tears. "I loved her, Diane. I would have died for her, and she destroyed me for sport." The interview lasted 45 minutes. By noon, hashtag Justice for Richard was trending on Twitter. By evening, it had spread to Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Internet sleuths were digging into the Whitmore family history, finding old lawsuits, business controversies, anything that painted them as villains. A GoFundMe page appeared. Help Richard Thornton fight back against billionaire bullies. It raised $50,000 in the first 6 hours. Cable news picked up the story. Pundits debated whether Margaret had committed fraud by hiding her identity. Legal experts questioned whether the asset seizure was too aggressive. Op-ed writers penned articles about the cruelty of the ultra-wealthy. Richard watched it all from his motel room, eating cold pizza and laughing for the first time in weeks. The narrative had shifted. He wasn't the cheating embezzler anymore. He was the victim of a billionaire's twisted game. In the Whitmore estate, the mood was considerably less triumphant. Charles Whitmore stood in front of a massive television watching clips of Richard's interview play on repeat across 6 different news channels. His face was stone. His knuckles were white around his cane. "I want to buy that network," he growled. "I want every person involved in that interview fired by sunset." "Dad, no." Margaret's voice was calm, but her eyes were fixed on the screen. "That's exactly what he wants. If we attack the media, we prove his point. We become the bullies. We are being slandered on national television." "I know." Eleanor paced behind them, her phone pressed to her ear. She hung up and turned to face her family. "Our stock dropped 3 points this morning. Board members are calling asking if they should be concerned. 2 major clients have postponed meetings pending resolution of the situation." "This is ridiculous," Charles snapped. "We have evidence. We have proof. The man embezzled $5 million. Evidence doesn't matter on social media, Dad." Eleanor's voice was tight with frustration. "Narrative matters. And right now, Richard is winning the narrative." Margaret stood up from her chair. She walked to the window and looked out at the manicured gardens. Gardens her mother had designed 30 years ago. Gardens she used to play in as a child, before she understood what it meant to be a Whitmore. "He's not wrong," she said quietly. Charles and Eleanor both turned to stare at her. "What?" Charles demanded. "I said he's not wrong. Not about everything." Margaret's voice was steady, but something in it was cracking. "I did lie to him. For 15 years I pretended to be someone I wasn't." "You were protecting yourself." "Was I?" Margaret turned to face her father. "Or was I testing him? Wasn't that the whole point? To see if someone could love me without knowing about the money?" "Maggie?" "I set him up to fail, Dad. I married a man and waited 15 years to see if he would betray me. And when he did, I had an army ready to destroy him." "He deserved to be destroyed," Eleanor said sharply. "He cheated on you. He stole from you. He tried to leave you with nothing." "I know what he did." Margaret's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "But I'm starting to wonder if I created the monster. If I had been honest from the beginning, if I had trusted him with the truth, would he have become this person?" Charles crossed the room and took his daughter's hands. "Listen to me," he said, his voice softer than Eleanor had heard in years. "Your mother asked the same question about me. When we first met, she didn't tell me who her family was. She wanted to know if I loved her for her." Margaret looked up. "I didn't know that." "She never told you because she was ashamed of the test. But here's what she learned, and what you need to learn now." Charles squeezed her hands. "The test doesn't create the person. It reveals them. Richard was always capable of this cruelty. You just gave him the opportunity to show it." "Then why do I feel like the villain?" "Because you have a conscience. He doesn't. That's the difference." Eleanor's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen and her face went pale. "We have a problem." "What now?" "Richard's lawyer just filed a motion. He's claiming psychological abuse. He's saying Margaret's deception constitutes fraud, and he's asking the court to invalidate the prenuptial agreement." "There is no prenuptial agreement," Margaret said. "We never signed one." "Exactly. Which means in a community property state he could argue for half of everything. including your trust fund distributions during the marriage. Charles's face darkened. That's over $200 million. I know. Margaret felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders. The narrative wasn't just a PR problem anymore. Richard was using public sympathy to build a legal strategy. If he could convince a judge that he was the victim, the financial consequences would be catastrophic. We need to fight back, Eleanor said. Not with lawyers, with evidence. We need to destroy his credibility before this goes any further. How? Margaret asked. He's already got the public on his side. Because the public hasn't seen the real Richard. Eleanor's eyes gleamed with something dangerous. But we have recordings, text messages, financial records that prove premeditation. We need to stop playing defense and start playing offense. A public deposition, Margaret said slowly. Live streamed. Let him tell his story under oath and then tear it apart piece by piece. Charles nodded. The courts have been allowing transparency measures in high-profile cases. Given the media attention, we could argue it's necessary to protect the integrity of the proceedings. Richard will never agree to that. He doesn't have a choice. Eleanor was already typing on her phone. I'm filing the motion tonight. If he refuses, it looks like he has something to hide. If he agrees, we expose him. Margaret looked at her sister. Ellie, I need to ask you something. What? Do you hate me for leaving? The question hung in the air. Eleanor's fingers stopped moving on her phone. I used to, she admitted. For years I was angry. You got to escape. You got to pretend to be normal while I stayed here carrying the family name, meeting the expectations, being the perfect Whitmore daughter. I'm sorry. I know. Eleanor set down her phone. But watching you these past few weeks, seeing you fight instead of run, I realized something. You didn't escape Maggie. You just took the long way home. Margaret crossed the room and hugged her sister. It was awkward at first. They hadn't embraced in 17 years. But Eleanor hugged her back. We're going to destroy him, Eleanor whispered. Together. Together. Charles watched his daughters with something that might have been pride, or might have been the ghost of his late wife, smiling through him. All right, he said, tapping his cane against the floor. Let's go to war. Richard received the subpoena 3 days later. He was in his motel room counting the GoFundMe money that had been transferred to his account when his new lawyer knocked on the door. Gary Finkel was not Marcus Webb. Gary was a small man with a cheap suit, a comb-over, and an office above a laundromat in Hell's Kitchen. He advertised on bus benches. He had never faced a Whitmore in court. But he was all Richard could afford. This is bad, Gary said, dropping the papers on the motel bed. They're demanding a public deposition, live-streamed. Portions can be released to media. That's good, Richard said, confused. I want to tell my story. The more people who see me, the more support I get. Richard, you don't understand. A deposition isn't a talk show interview. You'll be under oath. They can ask you anything, and they will have evidence. Evidence of what I told the truth. Gary stared at him. Did you? Richard's smile flickered. I told my truth. That's what matters. No, Richard. What matters is what they can prove. Gary pulled out a second document. They're also claiming to have audio recordings, text messages, financial records. They're saying they can demonstrate premeditated fraud. They're bluffing. Are they? Gary's voice was sharp. Because I've seen what the Whitmores do to people who cross them. They don't bluff. They annihilate. Richard grabbed the subpoena and skimmed through it. Fine, let them try. I'll go to their deposition. I'll look into the cameras and tell America exactly what Margaret Whitmore did to me. And when I'm done, she'll be the villain. Gary sighed. I hope you're right, because if you're wrong, this deposition will be the end of your life as you know it. My life as I knew it already ended. Richard's jaw tightened. Now I'm building a new one, on top of their graves. The deposition was scheduled for 2 weeks later. The venue was a conference room at the Four Seasons Hotel, chosen for its neutrality and its ability to accommodate the media circus the case had become. Cameras were set up in the corners. A live feed would broadcast to major news networks and streaming platforms. Richard arrived with Gary Finkel and a new confidence. The GoFundMe had exceeded $200,000. His social media following had grown to 500,000. He had received interview requests from every major network. A literary agent had contacted him about a book deal. He was winning. He could feel it. Margaret was already seated when he entered. She wore a simple white dress. No jewelry. Her hair was pulled back. She looked calm. Too calm. Charles Whitmore sat beside her, his cane resting against the table. Eleanor was on her other side, organizing files with surgical precision. Behind them sat 8 lawyers from Whitmore Legal Group. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They just watched Richard with the patient focus of predators. Richard sat down across from Margaret. He smiled at her. "Hello, Maggie. It's been a while." Margaret didn't respond. She just looked at him with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Mr. Thornton," the court reporter said, "do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do." Eleanor stood up. "Mr. Thornton, you stated in a national television interview that you were unaware of your wife's family wealth. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And you claimed that you moved company funds only to protect against a suspected hostile takeover." "Yes." "And you described yourself as a loving, faithful husband who was psychologically manipulated by his wife." "That's exactly right." Richard looked at the cameras. "I was a victim." Eleanor nodded slowly. She walked to the table and picked up a small USB drive. "Exhibit A," she said. "Audio recording recovered from Mr. Thornton's cloud storage." Richard's smile wavered. "What audio recording?" "You really should have changed your password after the divorce filing. Password 123 isn't particularly secure." She handed the drive to the technician. A moment later, Richard's voice filled the room. "I'm telling you, Amber, it's almost too easy. The dumb cow doesn't suspect a thing. I signed the transfer for another $1 million today. I'm going to bleed this company dry, declare bankruptcy, and leave Margaret with the debt. She's so desperate for my approval she'll sign anything. I can't wait to dump her and get a real life." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard's face had gone white. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. "For the record," Eleanor said, "that recording is dated 14 months before the divorce filing. 14 months before you claimed to be blindsided by your wife's family. That's been manipulated. It's AI. Deep fake technology. It's been authenticated by 3 independent forensic labs." Eleanor slid a stack of documents across the table. "Here are their reports." She picked up a second file. "Exhibit B, email correspondence between you and a corporate liquidator named Vincent Marsh." She read aloud. "Subject: selling out Margaret. Body: once I strip the assets you can buy the shell company for pennies. I'll make sure the wife takes the fall for the IRS audit. She's clueless. I need the cash for the gambling debts in Macau." Richard's hands were shaking now. "Those emails are fake. They're time-stamped. They're from your personal account. They include references to specific gambling markers that we've verified with the Venetian Macau." Eleanor set down the file and looked directly at Richard. "You didn't just cheat on your wife, Mr. Thornton. You didn't just steal from your company. You had a plan. For years you systematically drained assets while plotting to leave Margaret destitute and criminally liable for your fraud." "I want to speak to my lawyer." "You're in a deposition, Mr. Thornton. You don't get to pause." Margaret spoke then. Her voice was soft, but carried to every corner of the room. "Richard?" He looked at her. His arrogance was gone. His confidence was gone. All that remained was fear. "You told me I brought nothing to this marriage." Margaret's voice didn't waver. "You told me I was dead weight. You told me anyone could have done what I did." She stood up. But here's what you forgot. I didn't just cook your dinners and format your business plans. I watched you. For 15 years, I watched you. And I remembered everything. She leaned forward. I remember the time you cried in my arms because your first startup failed. I remember holding you through panic attacks at 3 in the morning. I remember believing in you when no one else would. Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. And I remember the exact moment you stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as an obstacle. It was 3 years ago. We were having breakfast and you looked at me like I was furniture, like I was something in your way. Richard's eyes were wet. Whether from guilt or self-pity, Margaret couldn't tell. I gave you everything, she said. Not my family's money. Me. My trust. My love. My best years. And you threw it away for gambling debts and a woman who left you the moment your credit card stopped working. She straightened up. You want to know the difference between us, Richard? When you looked at me, you saw a bank account. When I looked at you, I saw a husband. I was wrong about what I saw, but you were wrong about what you saw too. She sat back down. I'm not a bank account. I'm a Whitmore. And Whitmores don't lose. Eleanor took over. Mr. Thornton, based on the evidence presented, we are amending our countersuit to include racketeering charges. Your embezzlement scheme meets the legal definition of organized criminal activity. The maximum sentence is 20 years. Gary Finkel stood up abruptly. I'm resigning as counsel, he announced. I don't represent perjurers. Gary, wait. Richard grabbed his sleeve. You can't leave me. Gary pulled his arm free. You lied to me, Richard. You lied to everyone. Find yourself another lawyer. I'm done. He walked out. Richard sat alone at the table, surrounded by cameras broadcasting his humiliation to millions of viewers. The hashtag Justice for Richard was already being replaced. Justice for Margaret was trending, and Richard Thornton finally understood that he hadn't just lost his marriage, his company, or his freedom. He had lost everything, and there was no one left to blame but himself. The deposition footage spread across the internet like wildfire. Within hours, every major news network had played the audio recording. Richard's voice saying, "Dumb cow," became a meme. His face frozen in terror as the evidence mounted was screenshot and shared millions of times. The GoFundMe page that had raised $200,000 was shut down. Donors demanded refunds. The literary agent who had promised a book deal stopped returning calls. Richard sat in his motel room, watching his destruction unfold on a cracked smartphone screen. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. The comments section was merciless. He called her a dumb cow, and she turned out to own the whole farm. Imagine spending 15 years with a billionaire and being too stupid to notice. Richard Thornton is proof that karma has perfect timing. Richard hurled the phone against the wall. It shattered pieces, scattering across the stained carpet. He needed a new lawyer. He needed a new strategy. He needed something, anything, to stop the bleeding. His burner phone rang, the one Victor Castellano had given him. Richard's blood went cold. Hello? Richard. Victor's voice was silk wrapped around a razor. I've been watching the news. Quite a performance you gave today. Victor, I can explain. You don't need to explain anything to me. I don't care about your marriage or your fraud or your stupid recordings. What I care about is my money. I'm going to pay you back. I just need more time. Time. Victor laughed softly. You owe me $2.4 million with interest. You have no job, no assets, no prospects. What exactly are you going to pay me with? Richard's throat tightened. I'll figure something out. You have 30 days, Richard. After that, my associates will help you figure it out. And trust me, you won't enjoy their methods. The line went dead. Richard stared at the phone in his hand. 30 days. He had 30 days to come up with $2.4 million, or Victor Castellano's men would come for him. And Victor's men didn't negotiate. They collected. One way or another. Richard grabbed his jacket and walked out of the motel room. He needed air. He needed to think. He needed a miracle. The parking lot was empty except for a few rusted cars and a homeless man sleeping on a bench. Richard walked past them all, his mind racing. There had to be something. Some angle he hadn't considered. Some leverage he still possessed. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Mr. Thornton, I represent parties interested in your situation. Meet me at the diner on 47th Street in 1 hour. Come alone." Richard stared at the message. It could be a trap. It could be one of Victor's games. It could be a reporter looking for a story. But it could also be a lifeline. He had nothing left to lose. The diner was nearly empty. Richard slid into a booth at the back facing the door. An old habit from his business days. Always see who's coming. A woman approached. Mid-40s, sharp features, expensive clothes that tried to look cheap. She sat across from him without asking permission. "Mr. Thornton, thank you for meeting me." "Who are you?" "My name is Catherine Wells. I work for people who have been watching the Whitmore family for a very long time." "What people?" Catherine smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "People who believe the Whitmores have too much power. People who would benefit from seeing that power diminished." Richard leaned back. "You want to use me. We want to help you. There's a difference." "What kind of help?" Catherine placed a slim folder on the table. "Information. The Whitmores aren't as clean as they pretend to be. Charles Whitmore built his empire on the backs of broken unions and environmental violations. Eleanor has buried more lawsuits than she's won, and Margaret—" Catherine paused for effect. "Margaret has secrets too." Richard's eyes narrowed. "What secrets?" "That's what we're offering. Evidence that could change everything. Evidence that could make you the victim again." "In exchange for what?" "Your testimony. When the time comes, you'll say what we need you to say. You'll point fingers where we need them pointed. And in return, we'll make sure you walk away from this with enough money to start over." Richard looked at the folder. He should walk away. He knew that. Whatever these people wanted, it wasn't going to end well for anyone. But $2.4 million was waiting for him in 30 days. And Victor Castellano's patience had already run out. "Show me what you have." Catherine opened the folder. Inside were photographs, documents, transcripts. Richard's eyes widened as he read. This could destroy them." "Yes." Catherine's smile sharpened. "It could." Richard looked up at her. "I'm in." Margaret was in her father's study when her phone rang. She had been reviewing quarterly reports, trying to focus on business while the chaos of the past weeks swirled around her. The deposition had been a victory, but it felt hollow. She had destroyed Richard, publicly, completely. So why did she still feel empty? The phone showed Eleanor's name. "Ellie?" "We have a problem." Eleanor's voice was tight. "Richard met with someone today. A woman named Catherine Wells." "Who is she?" "She works for Blackstone Partners. They're a shell company connected to Harrison Burke." Margaret's blood went cold. Harrison Burke was one of her father's oldest enemies. They had been rivals since the 1980s, fighting over steel contracts and shipping lanes and political influence. The feud had cost both families millions over the decades. If Burke was getting involved now, this wasn't about Richard anymore. This was about the Whitmores. "What does Burke want?" "We don't know yet, but whatever Richard has agreed to, it won't be good for us." Margaret stood up from her desk. "I'm coming to the office. We need to talk to Dad." "Already called him. He's on his way." Margaret hung up and grabbed her coat. Her hands were steady, but her heart was racing. Richard had been a nuisance, a problem to be solved. But Harrison Burke was something else entirely. He was a war. Charles Whitmore arrived at the family office, looking older than Margaret had ever seen him. He moved slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. His face was gray. His breathing was labored. Dad, are you okay? I'm fine. Charles waved off her concern. Just tired. What do we know about Burke's involvement? Eleanor pulled up files on the conference room screen. Catherine Wells has been on Burke's payroll for 8 years. She specializes in information warfare, corporate espionage, reputation destruction. She's his hatchet woman, Charles said grimly. I've seen her work before. She doesn't get involved unless Burke is planning something big. What could he possibly want? Margaret asked. The feud has been quiet for years. The feud has been dormant, Charles corrected. Not dead. Burke has been waiting for an opportunity, and Richard just handed him one. What opportunity? Charles was silent for a long moment. There are things about our family that I've kept hidden. Things that happened before you were born, before your mother and I were married. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. What things? In 1987, I made a deal with the devil to save this company. Charles's voice was heavy with decades of regret. Burke knows about it. He's always known. But he never had a way to use it against me without exposing himself. And now he has Richard, a sympathetic figure, a man wronged by the Whitmores. If Burke feeds him the right information, Richard becomes a weapon. And I become the villain. Eleanor's face was pale. Dad, what did you do in 1987? Charles closed his eyes. I bribed a federal judge to rule in our favor on a land dispute. Burke was on the other side of that dispute. He lost $50 million because of my corruption. The room was silent. Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. You bribed a judge? I was young, desperate. The company was about to go under. I did what I thought I had to do. Charles opened his eyes. I've spent 40 years trying to make up for it, building charities, supporting communities, being better than that moment. But the moment still happened. Yes, and Burke has the records, the bank transfers, the judge's confession. If that information goes public, everything we've built comes crashing down. Margaret sank into a chair. She had spent 15 years hiding from her family name. Now she understood why. The name was built on sand. What do we do? Eleanor asked. We find out what Burke is planning, Charles said. And we stop him before he can use Richard to destroy us. How? Charles looked at his daughters. We do what Whitmores have always done. We fight, and we win. Richard met with Catherine Wells 3 more times over the following week. Each meeting she gave him more. Documents, recordings, witness statements. The picture she painted was damning. Charles Whitmore wasn't just a ruthless businessman. He was a criminal. A man who had bought judges, destroyed competitors, and covered up environmental disasters that had poisoned entire communities. This is incredible, Richard said, leafing through the latest batch of evidence. This could put him in prison for life. That's the idea. Catherine sipped her coffee. But we need you to be the one who reveals it. Me? You're the face of this story now. America knows your name. When you stand up and expose Charles Whitmore, people will believe you. Richard hesitated. What about Margaret? What about her? She's innocent in all this. She didn't know about her father's crimes. Catherine's eyes hardened. Margaret Whitmore humiliated you on national television. She called you a monster. She destroyed your reputation and your career. Are you really worried about protecting her? Richard thought about the deposition. The way Margaret had looked at him. The disappointment in her eyes. Not anger. Not hatred. Disappointment. Like he had failed a test he didn't know he was taking. She's not innocent, Richard said, pushing down the flicker of doubt. She's one of them. Exactly. Catherine smiled. So let's finish what you started. Margaret couldn't sleep. She wandered through the empty halls of the Whitmore estate, past portraits of ancestors who had built empires and destroyed rivals. Past her mother's study, still preserved exactly as it had been the day she died. Margaret stopped at the door. She hadn't entered this room in 17 years. Her hand trembled as she turned the handle. The room smelled of old books and faded perfume. Her mother's desk was covered in dust. Photographs lined the walls. Margaret as a child, Eleanor as a teenager, Charles younger and happier with his arm around his wife. Margaret walked to the desk and sat down. In the drawer she found her mother's journal, the one she had kept during her illness. Margaret opened it to a random page. "My greatest regret," her mother had written, "is not telling my daughters the truth about Charles, about our family, about the price we paid for everything we have. I wanted to protect them from the ugliness. But secrets don't protect, they poison." Margaret's vision blurred with tears. "I hope someday they'll understand. I hope they'll forgive us. And I hope they'll be stronger than we were, strong enough to face the truth, strong enough to be better." Margaret closed the journal. Her mother had known. All along she had known about Charles's sins, and she had carried that secret to her grave. Margaret understood now why she had run away at 25. Some part of her had always sensed the rot beneath the surface. She had escaped to avoid confronting it. But there was no escape anymore. The truth was coming whether she was ready or not. The question was whether she would let it destroy her family, or use it to set them free. Margaret found her father in his office at 3 in the morning. He was sitting in the dark staring at an old photograph. His wife, young and beautiful before the cancer took her. "Dad," he didn't look up. "Your mother wanted me to confess. Years ago when she first got sick, she said the guilt would kill me if the cancer killed her. Why didn't you?" "Because I was afraid. Afraid of prison. Afraid of losing everything. Afraid of what you and Eleanor would think of me." Charles finally looked at his daughter. "I'm still afraid, Maggie. But I'm more afraid of what happens if Burke controls how this story gets told." Margaret sat down across from him. "Then we tell it first." "What?" "We get ahead of it. Before Burke can use Richard. Before the evidence goes public. We hold a press conference. You confess to what you did in 1987. You face the consequences." Charles stared at her. "You want me to destroy myself. I want you to save yourself. Save us." Margaret leaned forward. "If Burke reveals this, we're victims. We're criminals caught in a cover-up. But if you confess voluntarily, you're a man seeking redemption. A man brave enough to face his past. I could go to prison. Maybe. Probably. But Eleanor and I can rebuild. The company can survive. The family name can recover." Margaret's voice cracked. "If you let Burke do this, none of that is true." Charles was silent for a long time. Finally, he set down the photograph. "Your mother would have said the same thing. I know. She was braver than me. She always was. Then be brave for her. Be brave for us." Charles closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had changed. The fear was still there, but beneath it was something else. Resolution. "Set up the press conference," he said. "Tomorrow morning, before Richard can make his move." "Are you sure?" "No." Charles smiled sadly. "But I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of carrying this weight. And I'm tired of letting men like Harrison Burke control my family's destiny." He stood up slowly, leaning on his cane. "If I'm going down on my own terms. And I'm taking Burke with me." Margaret hugged her father. It was the first time she had hugged him since she was 25 years old. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, sweetheart. I'm sorry I wasn't the man you deserved." "You're the man you're going to become. That's what matters." Charles pulled back and looked at his daughter. "When did you get so wise?" "I learned it from a woman who was brave enough to keep a journal, even when she was dying." Charles's eyes glistened. "She would be proud of you, Maggie. So proud." "Then let's make sure she didn't die protecting secrets that should have been told." Charles nodded. "Tomorrow, then. We end this. We end this." Richard received the news at 6 in the morning. Catherine Wells called him, her voice sharp with barely contained fury. "Turn on the television. Now." Richard fumbled for the remote. Charles Whitmore's face filled the screen. He was standing at a podium flanked by his daughters facing a wall of cameras and reporters. "What is this?" Richard demanded. "Shut up and watch." Charles cleared his throat. "I come before you today to confess to crimes I committed 40 years ago. Crimes that have haunted me every day since. Crimes that I can no longer hide from." Richard's blood went cold. In 1987, I bribed a federal judge to rule in favor of Whitmore Industries in a land dispute. I broke the law. I betrayed the public trust. And I have spent 40 years lying about it. The reporters erupted with questions. Charles held up his hand. "I am making this confession voluntarily. I am prepared to face whatever legal consequences result. I am also prepared to make full restitution to all parties harmed by my actions, including my longtime rival, Harrison Burke." Catherine cursed violently on the other end of the phone. "This ruins everything. He's taken our ammunition and used it as a shield." Richard couldn't respond. He was watching Margaret on the screen. She stood beside her father, her face calm and resolved. She looked directly into the camera. She looked directly at him. And in that moment, Richard understood. He had been outplayed. Again. Charles continued his confession for another 20 minutes. He named names. He provided evidence. He held nothing back. When he finished, he stepped away from the podium. Margaret took his place. "My family is not perfect," she said. "We have made mistakes. We have committed sins. But today we choose accountability over secrecy. We choose truth over comfort." She paused. "To anyone who has been hurt by our actions, past or present, we are sorry. And we are committed to making things right." The press conference ended. Richard sat alone in his motel room watching the aftermath unfold. Within hours, the narrative shifted again. Charles Whitmore wasn't a villain anymore. He was a flawed man seeking redemption. The public, which had been ready to crucify the Whitmores yesterday, was now praising their courage. Harrison Burke's plan was in ruins, and Richard was more alone than ever. His phone buzzed, a text from Catherine Wells. "You're on your own. Don't contact me again." Richard dropped the phone. 28 days until Victor Castellano's deadline. No allies, no money, no options. And the woman he had tried to destroy was stronger than ever. Richard buried his face in his hands. For the first time in his life, he had no idea what to do next. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a Monday morning. 6 months had passed since the deposition that destroyed Richard Thornton. 6 months since Charles Whitmore's confession. 6 months since the world watched the Whitmore family choose truth over power. Richard had spent those months in a federal holding facility awaiting trial. Victor Castellano's deadline had come and gone. Richard had nothing to pay with, so Victor had taken payment in a different currency. 2 broken ribs, a shattered kneecap, a face that would never quite look the same. The guards had found him in his cell, beaten nearly to death. Victor's men had connections everywhere. Prison walls meant nothing to them. Richard survived, barely. Now he stood in the same courthouse where he had once laughed at Margaret, the same room where he had expected to leave her penniless and broken. He wore an orange jumpsuit. His head was shaved. His face was gaunt and scarred. He had lost 40 pounds. His expensive Italian suits were gone, replaced by prison-issue fabric that scratched against his healing wounds. He looked 20 years older than 45. Margaret sat in the gallery flanked by Eleanor and Charles. Charles looked different too. The press conference confession had triggered a federal investigation. He had pleaded guilty to bribery charges and been sentenced to 2 years of house arrest, 500 hours of community service, and a $50 million fine. The punishment was lenient. The judge had cited his voluntary confession, his cooperation with investigators, and his decades of philanthropic work as mitigating factors. But the real punishment was in Charles's eyes. The weight of public exposure. The shame of his daughters knowing exactly who their father was. He leaned on his cane more heavily now. His silver hair had gone completely white. He looked like a man who had finally set down a burden he had carried for 40 years. He looked tired, but he also looked free. All rise, the bailiff announced. The Honorable Judge Caroline Hayes presiding. Judge Hayes entered. The same judge who had overseen the preliminary hearing. The same judge who had watched Richard's empire crumble in real time. She settled into her seat and reviewed the file before her. "We are here for the sentencing of Richard Allen Thornton," she said. "The defendant has pleaded guilty to 3 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of embezzlement, and 1 count of perjury." Richard stood at the defense table. He had no lawyer beside him. He couldn't afford one, and no public defender wanted to touch his case. He was alone. "Mr. Thornton," Judge Hayes said, peering over her glasses, "before I pronounce sentence, do you have anything you wish to say?" Richard's hands trembled. He gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his cell. He had practiced speeches, apologies, excuses, justifications. He had imagined looking Margaret in the eye and telling her everything she wanted to hear. But now, standing here, all the words felt hollow. "Your Honor," he began, his voice cracking. I don't know what to say." "Then perhaps you should say nothing." "No. Please." Richard turned to look at Margaret. "I need to say something, not to the court, to her." Judge Hayes frowned but nodded. "You may address your victim." Richard faced Margaret. She looked different too. Not broken, not bitter. She looked like a woman who had walked through fire and emerged tempered rather than burned. She looked like her father's daughter. "Margaret," Richard said, "I had a whole speech prepared about how the pressure got to me, about how the money corrupted me, about how I wasn't always this person." He paused. "But that's all lies. I was always this person. I just hid it better." Margaret didn't respond. She just watched him with those dark, unreadable eyes. "When we first met, you told me about your family. You said they were difficult. You said you wanted to build something real, something that belonged to you, not to a name." Richard's voice broke. "I told you I understood. I told you I loved you for who you were, and I meant it. At least I thought I meant it." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "But somewhere along the way I stopped seeing you. I started seeing obstacles, competition, something to overcome instead of someone to love." "You called me a dumb cow," Margaret said quietly. Richard flinched as if she had struck him. "Yes, I did." "You planned to leave me with your debt. You wanted me to go to prison for your crimes." "Yes." "You cheated on me with a woman half your age while I was home making you dinner, believing you were working late." "Yes." Margaret stood up. "Then let me tell you something, Richard. Something I should have said 15 years ago." She walked to the railing that separated the gallery from the court floor. "I knew." Richard blinked. "What?" "I knew something was wrong. For years I felt it. The way you looked at me changed. The way you touched me changed. The way you talked about our future became your future, not ours." Margaret's voice was steady, but her eyes glistened. "I stayed because I wanted to believe I was wrong. I stayed because admitting the truth meant admitting I had wasted my best years on a man who didn't deserve them." She gripped the railing. "But here's what I learned, Richard. Those years weren't wasted. They taught me who I am. They taught me what I'm capable of. They taught me that I don't need anyone to complete me." Richard's legs buckled. A guard steadied him. "I forgive you," Margaret said. Richard's head snapped up. "What? I forgive you, not because you deserve it, not because what you did is forgivable, but because carrying this hatred is too heavy, because I refuse to let you take up any more space in my heart." She straightened up. "You wanted to destroy me, Richard. Instead, you set me free. So thank you. Thank you for being the worst thing that ever happened to me, because it led me to the best version of myself." She turned and walked back to her seat. Richard stood frozen, tears streaming down his face. Judge Hayes cleared her throat. "Mr. Thornton, I have presided over many divorce cases, many fraud cases, many instances of human cruelty dressed up in expensive suits." She leaned forward. But rarely have I seen such a complete absence of character. You had everything: a loving wife, a successful company, a life most people dream of. And you threw it away for greed and ego. Your Honor, I'm not finished. The judge's voice was ice. You then compounded your crimes by lying to the public. You manipulated the media. You portrayed yourself as a victim while plotting to destroy the woman who had given you everything. She picked up a document. The prosecution has recommended 20 years. Given the severity of your crimes and your complete lack of remorse until this moment, I am inclined to agree. Richard's face went white. However, the judge continued, Mrs. Thornton has submitted a letter requesting leniency. She believes that mercy, not vengeance, is the appropriate response. Richard looked at Margaret in disbelief. I have taken her request into consideration. Therefore, I am sentencing you to 12 years in federal prison with possibility of parole after 8. You will pay full restitution of $42 million to Thornton Industries and its parent company. This debt will be garnished from any future earnings until satisfied. The gavel came down. Court is adjourned. Richard collapsed into his chair. Guards moved forward to take him into custody. Margaret, he called out. Why did you ask for leniency? Margaret turned back one last time. Because my mother taught me that the measure of a person isn't how they treat their enemies. It's how they treat people who can't hurt them anymore. She looked at him with something that might have been pity. You can't hurt me anymore, Richard. You're just a man who made bad choices, and now you have 12 years to think about them. She walked out of the courtroom. Richard watched her go. The guards lifted him to his feet and led him toward the side door, toward the prison transport, toward the next chapter of his destroyed life. As he shuffled forward in his chains, he passed Charles Whitmore. The old man looked at him with cold blue eyes. You know what the worst part is, Charles said quietly. She really did love you. For 15 years she chose you over everything her family could offer. And you threw it away. Richard had no response. That's going to haunt you more than any prison sentence. Trust me. I know something about living with regret. Charles turned and followed his daughters out of the courtroom. Richard was led away in silence. The Manhattan sunshine was blinding after the dimness of the courthouse. Margaret stopped on the steps surrounded by reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing microphones thrust toward her face. Mrs. Thornton, how do you feel about the verdict? Margaret, what's next for you? Is it true you're taking over as permanent CEO? Eleanor stepped forward, shielding her sister from the press. Ms. Whitmore will make a statement later today. Please respect her privacy. The family's security team cleared a path to the waiting limousine. Margaret climbed inside. Charles followed, moving slowly, Eleanor close behind. The door closed. The noise faded. The car pulled away from the chaos. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Charles reached over and took Margaret's hand. How are you feeling, sweetheart? Margaret considered the question. I don't know. Relieved. Sad. Empty. She looked out the window at the city passing by. He was my husband for 15 years. I built a life with him. And now it's over. It's been over for a long time, Eleanor said gently. You just didn't want to see it. Maybe. Margaret leaned her head back against the seat. Or maybe I did see it and chose to believe anyway. Charles squeezed her hand. Your mother was the same way. She believed in people long after they had stopped deserving it. I thought it was weakness. I was wrong. It was strength. It doesn't feel like strength. It feels like stupidity. There's a thin line between the two. The difference is what you do next. Margaret turned to look at her father. What did you do next, after you made your mistakes? Charles was silent for a moment. I built hospitals. I funded schools. I created scholarships for kids who couldn't afford college. I spent 40 years trying to balance a scale that could never be balanced. Did it help? It helped other people. That's something. He paused. But the guilt never went away. Not until I confessed. Not until I stopped pretending to be something I wasn't. Margaret nodded slowly. I want to do something. With the company, with the money. I don't want to just run a business. I want to make a difference. What kind of difference? I don't know yet, but I spent 15 years pretending to be ordinary. Maybe now I can use what I actually am to help people who are struggling to survive. Eleanor leaned forward. We could start a foundation, focus on domestic abuse survivors, financial literacy for women leaving bad marriages, job training, legal aid. The Whitmore Foundation for Second Chances, Charles said quietly. Margaret smiled for the first time all day. I like that. Your mother would have loved it. I know. Margaret looked at the photograph of her mother that hung from Charles's cane. That's why I want to do it. The limousine pulled up to the Whitmore estate. Margaret stepped out and looked at the house where she had grown up. The house she had fled at 25. The house she had avoided for 17 years. It looked different now. It looked like home. 1 year later, the Whitmore Foundation for Second Chances opened its doors. The launch event was held in the same ballroom where Margaret's parents had celebrated their wedding 40 years earlier. The same room where Margaret had taken her first steps, spoken her first words, dreamed her first dreams. Now it was filled with 300 guests. Philanthropists, politicians, business leaders, survivors, women who had escaped abusive marriages, women who had been left with nothing and rebuilt everything, women who looked at Margaret not as a billionaire, but as one of their own. Margaret stood at the podium looking out at the crowd. 1 year ago, she said, I sat in a courtroom and watched my former husband receive his sentence. I was supposed to feel victorious. I was supposed to feel vindicated. She paused. I felt nothing, because revenge, it turns out, is empty. It doesn't heal anything. It doesn't build anything. It just transfers pain from one person to another. The room was silent. But today I feel something different. I feel hope, because this foundation isn't about revenge. It's about redemption. Not for the people who hurt us, but for ourselves, for our future. She gripped the podium. Every woman in this room has a story of being underestimated, dismissed, betrayed. A story of being told she wasn't enough, didn't have enough, couldn't be enough. Margaret's voice strengthened. I'm here to tell you that every one of those stories was wrong. You are enough. You have always been enough. And from this day forward, you will never face your battles alone. The applause was thunderous. Eleanor stepped up beside her sister. I spent 17 years resenting my sister for leaving, Eleanor said. I thought she was running away from responsibility. I was wrong. She was running toward something. A chance to discover who she was without a last name defining her. She looked at Margaret. Today I'm proud to stand beside her. Not as a Whitmore, but as her sister, her partner, her friend. The sisters embraced. Charles watched from the front row, tears streaming down his weathered face. Beside him sat an empty chair. A photograph of his late wife rested on the seat. She was here too. In spirit, in memory, in the legacy her daughters were building. After the speeches, the music, the celebration, Margaret slipped away to the garden. The garden her mother had designed. The garden where Margaret had played as a child. The garden she had tended during her marriage, the one small piece of herself she had refused to surrender. She sat on a stone bench and looked up at the stars. Mom, she whispered, I wish you could see this. I wish you could see who I've become. The wind rustled through the roses, a soft, gentle sound, like a whisper, like an answer. I understand now, Margaret continued. Why you kept Dad's secrets, why you stayed. It wasn't weakness, it was love. The kind of love that hopes for the best, even when the worst keeps happening. She wiped her eyes. I tried to love like that, with Richard. It didn't work. But I don't regret it, because it taught me that love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about being brave enough to love someone real. Footsteps approached. Eleanor sat down beside her. You okay? Yeah, I think I am. The board wants to talk about expanding the foundation to 3 more cities next year. Already. You inspired a lot of people tonight, Maggie. They want to be part of what you're building. Margaret smiled. What we're building? I couldn't have done any of this without you. You could have. You just didn't have to. Eleanor took her sister's hand. That's what family is supposed to be. We show up for each other. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. I'm sorry I left you alone for so long. You needed to find yourself. I understand that now. Eleanor squeezed her hand. The important thing is you came back. And you came back stronger than any of us expected. Strong enough to face whatever comes next. Maggie, you just took down your husband, exposed your father, survived a media hurricane, and launched a foundation that will change thousands of lives. I think you can handle whatever comes next. Margaret laughed. A real laugh. The first one in a very long time. You know what Richard said to me once? He said I was dead weight, that I was holding him back. And now, Margaret stood up and looked at the stars. Now I'm running a company worth $8 billion. I'm leading a foundation that will help survivors across the country. I'm standing in my mother's garden next to my sister with my whole life ahead of me. She turned to Eleanor. I wasn't holding him back. He was holding me down. And the moment he let go, I started to rise. Eleanor stood and hugged her sister. Mom would be proud. I know. Margaret held the embrace. I can feel her, right here, right now. They stood together in the moonlight, 2 sisters who had lost years to distance and misunderstanding, now closer than they had ever been. Behind them, the ballroom glowed with light and laughter. Ahead of them, the future stretched out, vast and full of possibility. Margaret Whitmore had spent 15 years pretending to be ordinary. She would spend the rest of her life proving that extraordinary was always inside her. Waiting. Ready. Unbreakable. And as the night settled over the Whitmore estate, one truth echoed through the darkness. Never underestimate a woman who has nothing left to lose. Because once she finds herself, she becomes unstoppable. Margaret Thornton was gone. Margaret Whitmore had risen. And she was just getting started. If you enjoyed this story of justice, transformation, and redemption, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment telling me what you would have done in Margaret's place. And remember, no matter how dark things get, your breakthrough is waiting just around the corner. Stay strong, stay hopeful, and never let anyone tell you that you're not enough.